A trapdoor was found beneath the Motel ice machine, 33 years after 3 boys vanished on a summer road trip, the concrete slab at the derelict Starlight Motel, a place long surrendered to dust, and the creeping vines of foreclosure, its faded sign, a ghostly sentinel against the indifferent sky, finally yielding its secret after all those aching summers that had bleached the paint from its clapboard walls, and all those desolate winters that had cracked its asphalt heart, a secret held tight since the boys, their laughter still an echo in the memories of those who loved them, vanished from the sun-drenched ribbon of Highway 17. It wasn't a grand unearthing, no dramatic crane lifting shattered pieces of foundation to the hushed awe of onlookers, but rather the mundane, grinding complaint of a demolition crew's pry bar, wielded by a man named Henderson whose thoughts were on lunch and the coming weekend, meeting unexpected resistance, a hollow thud where solid earth should have been, a sound that resonated with a grim finality, like a coffin lid closing for a second, terrible time, causing him to pause, wipe sweat from his brow, and call over his younger colleague, whose bored expression shifted to one of uneasy curiosity. They found it there, after chipping away at the edges of the surprisingly thin concrete cap, a crude trapdoor of weathered pine, barely visible beneath a generation of grime and compacted dirt. Its presence an anomaly, an aberration in the motel's blueprint, its rusted hinges groaning a metallic lament, a sound like a drawn-out sigh of resignation, as they forced it open with a concerted effort, revealing not bedrock, not the anticipated tangle of forgotten pipes or the burrow of some desert creature, but a void, a suffocating black square exhaling a breath of trapped time, stale and heavy with the scent of mildew, decaying leaves, and something else, something indefinably human and profoundly sorrowful. A smell that caught in their throats and coiled in their stomachs with a primal dread. The space was small, terrifyingly so, claustrophobic to a degree that made the air above feel thin and precious, an oubliette dug with crude determination into the unforgiving, sun-baked clay, never meant for light, never meant for comfort, never, it seemed, meant for escape, and on the splintered, damp underside of the wooden hatch, illuminated by the harsh, dancing glare of a workman's cheap flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness like a hesitant scalpel, 3 sets of initials were gouged into the soft, decaying wood, M.R. D.K.S.P., carved with what looked like a desperate, childish hand, perhaps using a stone or a nail, a fragile testament to identity's fighting oblivion, a last defiant whisper against the encroaching silence. Inside that cramped, airless pit, a veritable tomb no bigger than a discarded freezer, nestled amongst the damp earth, the skeletal remains of forgotten insects and the ghostly webs of spiders long dead, lay the artifacts of a lost summer, a lost generation of innocence. 3 mismatched sneakers, caked with reddish mud and the greenish patina of decades. A child's small red canvas shoe with a star emblem almost worn away. A slightly larger blue and white runner with a faded, unidentifiable logo. A third, almost a scuffed leather boot, its laces long disintegrated into the clinging soil, each one a poignant, unbearable symbol of a journey violently interrupted, a life stolen, a future erased. And beside them, half buried in the loose dirt as if placed there with a strange, almost tender reverence or perhaps dropped in haste, lay a bulky, old-fashioned JVC camcorder, its plastic casing cracked across the side, its lens clouded like a cataract-stricken eye peering into an unimaginable past, yet somehow, impossibly, appearing almost preserved in the cool, dark stillness, a silent, unblinking witness waiting for its story to be exhumed from the depths of its magnetic tape. Henderson, the foreman, a man hardened by years of dismantling forgotten lives and condemned structures, felt a chill crawl up his spine that had nothing to do with the dampness of the earth or the sudden draft from the disturbed opening. a primal recognition of tragedy so profound it seemed to seep from the very soil, to cling to the fetid air, and he knew, with a certainty that settled like a cold, heavy stone in his stomach, that this discovery was not just about forgotten property or structural anomalies, but about an answer, a horrifying, long-delayed answer to a question that had haunted the small, sun-baked town of Harmony Creek for over 3 decades, a question that began with 3 bright, smiling faces in a faded Polaroid photograph pinned to a corkboard in the sheriff's office, and ended, perhaps, right here, in this lightless, wretched hole beneath a monument to transient stays and broken dreams. The air around the opening thickened, heavy with unspoken fears, with the accumulated weight of years of silence, the silence of the missing, the silence of the earth that had held them, or their secrets, so tightly, so relentlessly for so long, a silence that was now broken by the ragged breathing of the 2 men and the distant, indifferent rumble of highway traffic. It was the kind of silence that screamed, a soundless accusation against the passage of time, against the ease with which the world moved on while some were left behind, tethered by an unbreakable thread of grief to a single, agonizing moment of not knowing, a moment that had stretched into an eternity of sorrow. This was more than just a find. It was an exhumation of collective grief, a brutal resurrection of a pain that many in Harmony Creek had tried to bury as deeply as this forsaken chamber itself. A pain that now threatened to crack open the carefully constructed facade of normalcy the town had built over the chasm of its greatest loss. The cheap plastic of the camcorder felt unnaturally cold, almost slick, in Henderson's gloved hand as he carefully lifted it, a relic from a bygone era, an era of simpler hopes and Kodachrome summers, now transformed into a potential harbinger of a truth that promised to be as dark and suffocating as the space from which it had been retrieved, a truth that would inevitably rewrite the narrative of a long cold case, a narrative that had, until this very moment, offered no solace, no resolution, only the gnawing, insidious emptiness of absence, the constant, dull ache of the unanswered. The initials, stark and crude, were a direct line to the past, a desperate message in a bottle thrown into an ocean of time, finally washed ashore, not on some hopeful sunlit beach, but in the gritty debris of a condemned motel, a place where dreams had clearly come to die, and perhaps where innocence itself had been systematically, cruelly laid to rest, its final, choked cries absorbed by the indifferent earth. Michael, he was the eldest, 12 years old in that sun-drenched, fateful summer of 1989, a boy on the cusp of adolescence, all lanky limbs and a sudden, surprising seriousness that would sometimes cloud his freckled face, a face that still bore the roundness of childhood but held eyes that seemed to understand more than he let on, protective of his younger brothers. Daniel, or Danny as everyone called him, who was 10, a whirlwind of nervous energy, perpetually scraped knees, and a laugh that could fill a room, a laugh that his mother, Sarah, would hear in her dreams for decades to come, a phantom echo in the silent house. And then there was Sam, the youngest, barely 8, with a gap-toothed smile and a fierce attachment to a worn plush rabbit named Hopper, his world still one of wonder and an unwavering belief in the goodness of things, a belief that the events of that summer would shatter for everyone else, if not for him, then for those left to mourn him. They were inseparable, those 3, a constellation of bright, boyish energy, their lives interwoven with the shared secrets and boundless adventures that only brothers can know, spending their days exploring the woods behind their modest suburban home, building forts that were always on the verge of collapse, and dreaming of the kind of grand adventures they read about in dog-eared library books, adventures that seemed to promise an escape from the ordinary, from the quiet hum of their small-town existence. That summer, the summer of '89, was meant to be one such adventure, a road trip with their Uncle Frank, Sarah's younger brother, A man who had always been a peripheral figure in their lives. Charming, in a restless, slightly unreliable way. A drifter with a string of short-lived jobs and a penchant for stories that often felt too grand to be entirely true. But he had a beat-up station wagon and a sudden, uncharacteristic urge to show the boys the country, or so he'd claimed, his eyes gleaming with an enthusiasm that Sarah, in retrospect, would dissect endlessly, searching for a flicker of falsehood, a hint of the darkness that was to come. She had hesitated, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach, a mother's intuition perhaps, or just the natural anxiety of entrusting her most precious treasures to a man she didn't fully understand. But Frank had been persuasive, painting pictures of national parks, campfires, and the kind of male bonding he swore they all needed. And the boys, oh, the boys had pleaded, but their eyes wide with the promise of the open road, the allure of freedom from summer chores, and the familiar confines of their neighborhood, so she had relented, packing their bags with a mixture of excitement for them and a persistent nagging worry she couldn't quite name, a worry that clung to her like the humid summer air. The last time she saw them, they were piled into Frank's wood-paneled wagon, waving, their faces pressed against the dusty glass, incandescent with joy, Michael giving a solemn thumbs up, Danny already orchestrating some game with Sam, who clutched Hopper tightly, his small face a beacon of pure, unadulterated happiness, and then the car had pulled away from the curb, turned the corner, and dissolved into the shimmering heat haze of a late June morning, taking with it the sound of their laughter, the warmth of their presence, the very center of Sarah's world. The postcards stopped after the first week, brief, scrawled messages from dusty roadside attractions, a giant ball of twine, a dinosaur park, Frank's handwriting growing increasingly erratic, the boys' messages shorter, less exuberant, than nothing. Just a widening silence that grew from a small worry into a gnawing dread, then into outright panic as days turned into a week, then two. With no word, no sign. The initial search was a blur of frantic phone calls, missing person posters with smiling, hopeful faces that soon became faded and rain-streaked. The sympathetic but ultimately helpless local police departments in a string of states Frank had vaguely mentioned as their route, each lead a dead end, each promising sighting a mirage. Frank's station wagon was found abandoned 3 weeks later, pulled off a lonely stretch of desert highway in Arizona, its doors unlocked, keys in the ignition, a half-eaten bag of chips on the dashboard. But no Frank, no boys, no Hopper, no sign of a struggle, just an eerie, silent testament to lives interrupted, as if they had simply evaporated into the vast, indifferent landscape. Theories bloomed like poisonous flowers. They had run away. Frank had taken them to start a new life. They had met with an accident in some remote, undiscovered canyon, or the darkest fear of all. They had fallen prey to someone, something, unimaginably evil. The case grew cold with the passing seasons, the file thickening with fruitless reports and the desperate, heartbroken letters Sarah wrote to anyone she thought might listen, her vibrant life shrinking until it was defined by one single, all-consuming purpose: to find her sons, or at least to know what had become of them, a quest that consumed her youth, her health, her marriage, leaving her a hollow shell animated by a fierce, unyielding flicker of hope, a hope that dwindled with each passing year but never fully extinguished, not even when the world seemed to forget. Not even when the official narrative became one of tragic, unsolved mystery. The Starlight Motel, a forgotten name on a disused highway loop, had never figured in any official report, never surfaced in any of the psychic readings or crackpot theories that well-meaning or opportunistic strangers offered Sarah over the years. It was just another crumbling relic of a past America. Its vacancy sign permanently dark, its pool a cracked basin of dead leaves and stagnant water, slowly being reclaimed by the tenacious desert flora. An unwitting mausoleum for secrets it had held for more than 3 decades, its peeling paint and broken windows a mirror to the decay of hope for so many. Yet now, it was the unlikely epicenter of a truth too terrible to comprehend, a truth that had waited patiently beneath the rhythmic hum and drip of an ice machine, a mundane fixture that had, day after day, year after year, unknowingly stood guard over the unimaginable. Sarah, now a woman in her late 60s, her vibrant auburn hair long faded to a soft, weary silver, her face a roadmap of sorrow etched by 33 years of relentless uncertainty, lived a life suspended in the amber of 1989, a life where every slammed door, every glimpse of a boy with freckles or a boisterous laugh, could send splinters of fresh pain through the carefully constructed scar tissue of her grief, a grief that had become her constant, unwelcome companion, shadowing her days and haunting her nights with the faces of Michael, Danny, and Sam, forever young, forever smiling, forever just out of reach. She had never moved from the house where their laughter once echoed, its rooms filled with their phantom presence, their bedrooms preserved as shrines, toys gathering dust, books open to the page where they had last stopped reading, a silent, heartbreaking testament to a hope she refused to surrender, even as the world around her urged her to move on, to find closure, words that felt like betrayals to the fierce maternal love that still burned within her, a love that demanded answers, not acceptance. The call came on a Tuesday morning, a typically quiet, sun-bleached morning, the kind that had once been filled with the sounds of her boys getting ready for a summer day, now marked only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that seemed to measure out the endless expanse of her waiting. It was a Detective Reynolds, a young woman with a gentle voice, new to the reopened cold case, a case Sarah had fought tooth and nail to keep from being permanently archived, her voice hesitant, careful, as she explained the discovery at the old Starlight Motel, words like trapdoor, children's shoes, and camcorder cutting through the fragile peace of Sarah's morning-like shards of glass, each syllable freighted with a terrifying, almost unbearable significance. Sarah listened in silence, her hand gripping the receiver so tightly her knuckles were white, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, the world around her receding, narrowing to the voice on the other end of the line, a voice that was offering not comfort, not yet, but the brutal, electrifying possibility of an end to the not knowing, an end that she had craved and dreaded in equal measure for more than half her life. She didn't cry, not then. The shock was too profound, too seismic, freezing her emotions in a state of suspended animation, but a tremor ran through her, a deep internal shudder, as if the foundations of her carefully managed existence were crumbling. The journey to Harmony Creek, a town she had only known from maps and police reports, a name synonymous with the vanishing point of her happiness, was a blur of arid landscapes and endless highways, each mile bringing her closer to a truth she wasn't sure she could bear, her mind a chaotic whirl of images. The boys' faces, Frank's shifty smile, the desolate stretch of road where the car was found, and now a new, horrifying image of a dark, cramped space beneath a motel. When she finally stood before the ruins of the Starlight, its demolition temporarily halted, the area cordoned off with yellow tape that fluttered like trapped birds in the desert wind, the place felt malevolent, a sentient entity that had hoarded its secrets, fed on her family's pain. The sight of the excavated square in the earth, the raw, disturbed soil around the opening to that unholy sepulchre, made her breath catch in her throat, a physical blow that stole the air from her lungs, and for a moment she thought her legs would give way, the years of stoic endurance, of carefully banked grief, threatening to collapse under the weight of this stark, brutal reality. Detective Reynolds, a woman whose compassionate eyes held a deep understanding of the abyss Sarah was confronting, gently led her towards the evidence table set up nearby. where the items retrieved from the pit were laid out with meticulous, almost reverent care. The 3 mismatched shoes, cleaned of the worst of the clinging earth but still bearing the stains of their long confinement. So small, so heartbreakingly familiar in their style, each one a dagger to Sarah's heart, conjuring images of tiny feet, of hurried morning routines, of summer adventures. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering over Danny's faded blue runner, the one he'd been so proud of, the fastest shoes in the world, he'd called them. And a sound escaped her, a low, guttural moan that was part grief, part recognition, part an agony too profound for words. Then she saw the camcorder, a bulky, anachronistic piece of technology, and a different kind of dread, a cold, intellectual fear, pierced through the fog of her sorrow. A camcorder, footage. What had it seen? What secrets did it hold within its fragile, magnetic heart? The thought of seeing her boys again, not as smiling photographs but as moving, breathing images from those last terrifying days, was both an unbearable temptation and a source of profound terror. Reynolds explained, her voice soft, that they hadn't viewed the tape yet, that they were waiting for specialists, for the right protocols, but the very existence of it, the fact that there might be a visual record, a testament from beyond the silence, changed everything. It meant that the story wasn't over, that the earth hadn't just swallowed them whole without a trace. It meant that there was a narrative, however horrifying, waiting to unfold. A narrative that might finally, after all these years, give a name to the darkness that had stolen her children, that had stolen her life. Sarah stood there, amidst the dust and decay of the Starlight Motel, the Arizona sun beating down on her silver hair, a fragile, aging woman on the precipice of a revelation that could either destroy her completely or, paradoxically, offer the only kind of peace she could now hope for. The peace of knowing, the terrible, searing peace of truth, no matter how devastating its content. The silence of the desert seemed to press in, amplifying the frantic beat of her own heart, as she braced herself for what the camera, that silent, dusty oracle, was about to reveal about the last days of Michael, Danny, and Sam. The old JVC camcorder, an artifact from a pre-digital age, became the focal point of an almost unbearable tension, a fragile vessel containing either the key to unimaginable horror or the final, definitive word on a tragedy that had resisted resolution for over 3 decades, its cracked plastic casing holding the potential to unlock the silence that had enveloped the fates of Michael, Danny, and Sam. Transported with the gentle, meticulous care usually reserved for ancient relics, it was taken to the state crime lab, a sterile, brightly lit environment so far removed from the dark earthen pit where it had lain dormant, a stark contrast that seemed to emphasize the chasm between the life it had recorded and the present moment of its potential resurrection. Sarah waited, a vigil she had unknowingly been keeping for 33 years now, condensed into agonizing hours, then days as technicians, their faces grim with the knowledge of what this tape might contain, worked to carefully extract and preserve its contents, the delicate magnetic ribbon, a lifeline to a lost time, a lost world. The process was fraught with peril. The tape was old, brittle, potentially damaged by moisture and the passage of time, each turn of the spool a gamble against its complete disintegration. Would it yield anything at all, or would it crumble to dust, taking its secrets with it to a final, irrevocable grave? The anticipation was a physical weight on Sarah, on Detective Reynolds, on the handful of cold case investigators who had inherited this ghost of a case, this lingering sorrow. Then came the call. They had managed to stabilize a portion of the tape, enough for an initial viewing, though its full length and condition were still uncertain. Sarah was asked if she wanted to be present, a question that felt both cruel and necessary, and she knew, with a certainty that transcended her fear, that she had to be there, she had to see. She had to bear witness, no matter how terrible the image is. For Michael, for Danny, for Sam, this was the last thing she could do for them, to hear their voices, perhaps, to see their faces one last time, even in terror, even in despair. She entered the viewing room, a small darkened space dominated by a large monitor, the air thick with a mixture of professional detachment and barely suppressed human emotion. Reynolds by her side, a silent, supportive presence. The technician, a young man with kind eyes, gave a quiet warning, his voice low. This might be difficult, extremely difficult, and Sarah simply nodded, her throat too tight for words, her hands clasped in her lap to still their trembling. The screen flickered, then resolved into a chaotic, jerky image, a confusing blur of darkness and fleeting, indistinct shapes, accompanied by a muffled, scraping sound and the low, rumbling hum of what sounded like a vehicle in motion, a disorienting, stomach-churning perspective that immediately conveyed a sense of confinement, of being trapped. Then, a child's whimper, unmistakably real, heartbreakingly familiar, a sound that pierced Sarah's carefully constructed composure like a hot knife, and her breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat. The image shifted, stabilized for a moment, and a sliver of light appeared, illuminating a small, dirt-streaked hand, fingers splayed against a rough, metallic surface, and Sarah knew. With a sickening lurch of her stomach, she knew that hand. She had kissed those fingers 1,000 times. It was Sam's hand, her baby's hand. The camera seemed to be lying on its side, perhaps dropped or wedged between unseen objects, its lens pointed upwards and erratically around, capturing fleeting, terrifying glimpses of a dark, enclosed space. The ridged metal of what could only be the inside of a car trunk, the curve of a spare tire, the glint of a jack. Then, faces swam into view, pale and wide-eyed in the intermittent flashes of light that seemed to come from passing streetlights or the headlights of other cars filtering through unseen cracks or perhaps a slightly ajar trunk lid. Michael's face, older, trying to be brave, but his eyes, those serious, knowing eyes, were filled with a terror that belied his attempted composure, his lips moving, forming words too muffled by the surrounding sounds to be decipherable, but his intent clear, trying to reassure, trying to protect. Danny, his usual boisterous energy extinguished, was curled into a ball, his small body shaking, his face buried, but then he looked up, his expression one of pure, unadulterated fear and confusion, his mouth open in a silent O of distress. And Sam, oh Sam, was crying, a soft, continuous, hopeless sound, clutching something to his chest, something small and indistinct in the poor light, perhaps Hopper, his faithful companion, his small face streaked with tears and dirt, his eyes darting around the suffocating darkness, as if searching for an escape that did not exist, searching for her, for his mother. Sarah choked back a scream, her hand flying to her mouth. The reality of what she was seeing, the confirmation of her deepest, most nightmarish fears, crashing down on her with the force of a physical blow. They were in a trunk, her boys, her babies, trapped, terrified, being driven somewhere unknown, by someone unknown, and the camcorder, their own camcorder, the one she had bought them to document their grand adventure, was now providing a horrifying first-person account of their abduction, their terror. The footage was raw, disjointed, punctuated by periods of complete blackness when the camera must have been covered or shifted, then sudden, sickening lurches of movement, the muffled sounds of voices from outside the trunk, indistinct shouts, a deeper, male voice, angry, urgent, but never clear enough to identify. There were no clear shots of their captor, no easy answers, just the claustrophobic, terrifying reality of the boys' experience, the dawning realization in their eyes that this was not a game, not an adventure gone slightly wrong, but something far, far worse. The camera operator was clearly one of the boys, perhaps Michael, trying to document, trying to leave a clue, or perhaps just fumbling with it in the darkness, unknowingly capturing these last, desperate moments. Each frame was an agony, each whimper a fresh wound, each glimpse of their terrified faces a confirmation of a suffering she could barely comprehend, let alone endure watching, yet she couldn't look away, mesmerized by the horror, by the irrefutable proof of their ordeal, her mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments, trying to understand how this could have happened. Who could have done this to them, to her innocent children? The initial segment of footage lasted perhaps 15 minutes, though it felt like an eternity spent in the suffocating darkness of that trunk with her sons, sharing their fear, their despair, their dwindling hope. And when the screen finally went dark, signaling the end of that particular recovered section, Sarah sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, the silence in the room amplifying the roaring in her ears, the images seared onto her memory, a new layer of trauma laid bare, a truth more terrible than 33 years of imagining had ever conjured. The forensic team, working with painstaking slowness, managed to recover more segments from the fragile tape, piecing together a fragmented, horrifying mosaic of the boys' final hours, or perhaps days. The chronology uncertain, the timeline blurred by the darkness and the trauma it recorded. Each newly salvaged snippet was examined with excruciating attention to detail, the investigators, alongside a heartbroken but resolute Sarah, searching for any clue, any whisper of information that might illuminate the path to their captor and their ultimate fate. The quality remained poor, the images often obscured, the sound distorted, yet within that grainy, flickering nightmare, moments of terrible clarity would emerge, offering fleeting, tantalizing glimpses into their ordeal. There were sounds, muffled but persistent, that suggested the vehicle was traveling for a significant period, the rhythmic thrum of tires on asphalt, the occasional louder rumble of a truck passing, the distant wail of a siren that seemed to offer a momentary, cruelly deceptive flicker of hope before fading away into the relentless drone of the engine. At one point, the camera, perhaps jostled, tilted upwards, capturing a brief, overexposed view through what might have been a poorly sealed trunk lid or a rust hole. A flash of blue sky, too bright, too indifferent, then the dark silhouette of power lines rushing past, suggesting a daytime journey through a rural or semi-rural landscape, endless, anonymous. There were no clear views of landmarks, no road signs, nothing to pinpoint their location or direction, just the suffocating confines of their prison and these fleeting, taunting glimpses of a world from which they were so cruelly sequestered. The boys' voices, when audible, were mostly whimpers, hushed whispers, fragments of terrified questions. Is anyone there? Michael's voice, strained, trying to be the older brother, the protector, but laced with an unmistakable tremor of fear. Mommy? Sam's small, lost voice, a recurring heartbreaking plea that twisted Sarah's insides with each utterance. Where are we going? Danny, his voice hoarse from crying or shouting, a note of bewildered anger mixed with his terror. There were moments when they seemed to speak to each other, huddled together for warmth or comfort in the cold, metallic darkness. I'm scared, one would whisper, and another would reply, me too, or, it's okay, we'll be okay. A fragile attempt at reassurance that sounded hollow even in the distorted audio. A brave lie in the face of an overwhelming, unspoken certainty that they were not, in fact, going to be okay. The presence of their Uncle Frank, the man who had taken them on this ill-fated journey, remained maddeningly ambiguous in these initial viewings. His voice was never clearly identifiable among the muffled sounds from outside the trunk, though once, a deeper male voice, rough and impatient, was heard shouting something indistinct, followed by a loud bang on the trunk lid, silencing the boys' whimpers for a terrified moment. Was it Frank or someone else? The footage offered no definitive answer, only more questions, more layers of agonizing uncertainty. Sarah scrutinized every frame, every shadow, searching for any sign of her brother, the man she had trusted, the man whose betrayal, if it was betrayal, would be an unbearable weight to add to her already crushing grief. The passage of time within the footage was difficult to gauge. The transitions between recovered segments were abrupt, marked by static or complete blackness, suggesting the camera had been turned off and on. Perhaps by the boys themselves in moments of desperate hope or fumbling fear, or perhaps its battery was failing, its lifeblood draining away just as theirs was. There were sequences where the boys appeared increasingly lethargic, their movements slower, their whimpers softer, almost inaudible, their small bodies curled together in a miserable, exhausted heap. The intermittent flashes of light from outside seemed to change in quality, sometimes the harsh white glare of daylight, other times the softer, more diffuse glow of streetlights or perhaps even moonlight, suggesting that their captivity spanned at least one night, possibly more, an eternity spent in that jolting, airless prison. The emotional deterioration was the hardest to watch. The initial terror, raw and vocal, gradually gave way to a chilling, despairing quietude, broken only by occasional soft sobs or the rasp of labored breathing. Sam, in one particularly agonizing segment, was no longer crying audibly but lay listless, his eyes wide and vacant, staring up at the dark roof of the trunk, Hopper clutched loosely in his small hand, his vibrant spark seemingly extinguished. Michael, too, appeared to be fading, his earlier attempts at bravery replaced by a grim, silent resignation, his gaze fixed, unseeing. Danny, always the most restless, was unnaturally still, his face hidden. It was the slow, agonizing erosion of hope, of life itself, captured on grainy, unforgiving videotape, a testament to their suffering, their endurance, and their ultimate, unbearable vulnerability. Sarah watched, her own breath catching in her chest, feeling as if she were suffocating alongside them, her grief a living thing, tearing at her, consuming her, yet she forced herself to keep looking, to absorb every detail, to burn their final moments into her soul, because this terrible, flickering record was all she had left of them, the last echoes of their stolen lives. The camcorder, once a symbol of summer fun, of family memories to be made, had become a reliquary of their terror, a silent, accusatory witness that offered no easy answers, only a deepening, chilling understanding of the darkness that had enveloped her sons. The question loomed, vast and terrifying. How did the boys, trapped in the trunk of a moving vehicle, end up in that horrific earthen pit beneath the Starlight Motel's ice machine, a place so disconnected from the desolate Arizona highway where Frank's station wagon had been found abandoned? The camcorder footage, for all its harrowing intimacy, offered no direct visual link to the motel itself. The views from within the trunk were too constricted, too fleeting, showing only generic glimpses of sky or passing infrastructure, nothing to identify a specific location, certainly not the faded facade or peeling sign of the Starlight. Yet, the very discovery of the camcorder inside the pit, alongside their shoes, was an undeniable, chilling tether. The investigators meticulously re-examined every second of the recovered footage, listening with enhanced audio equipment for any sound, any subtle clue that might have been missed, anything that could bridge the gap between the moving prison of the trunk and the static horror of the underground chamber. It was a painstaking process, like searching for a single grain of sand on an endless, desolate beach. Sarah, her eyes raw from unshed tears and lack of sleep, sat with Detective Reynolds, listening, watching, her maternal senses heightened to an almost painful degree, trying to catch a nuance, a forgotten detail from her boy's speech patterns, anything. Then, in one of the later segments, a segment where the boys were terrifyingly quiet, almost unresponsive. A new series of sounds emerged from the distorted audio track. Sounds that had previously been dismissed as mere background noise or interference. There was a rhythmic clanking, metallic and hollow, followed by a distinct, low hum, almost a vibration, that seemed to be coming from very close by, perhaps directly above the trunk. It was a sound that in isolation meant little, but when Henderson, the demolition foreman who had found the trapdoor, was brought in to listen, his brow furrowed, and he hesitantly identified it. "That hum," he said, his voice gravelly, "it sounds like an old commercial freezer unit, or maybe an ice machine, one of the big outdoor ones, the kind that rumbles when the compressor kicks in." An ice machine. The words hung in the sterile air of the lab, pregnant with a horrifying significance. The Starlight Motel. The trapdoor was beneath the ice machine. Could it be that the camcorder had continued to record even faintly after they were taken from the trunk, perhaps dropped or left behind as they were moved into that terrible hole? The chronology was still maddeningly unclear. Were they alive when they were put in there? The initials carved into the hatch suggested at least one of them had been conscious, aware, desperate. The investigators began to explore Frank's history with a renewed urgency, searching for any connection, however tenuous, to Harmony Creek or the Starlight Motel. Had he ever worked there, stayed there, known someone who did? His past was a tangled web of transient jobs and short-lived acquaintances, a drifter's unmoored existence that made tracing his steps 33 years later an almost impossible task. Yet they persisted, poring over old employment records, credit card slips if any existed, interviewing anyone who vaguely remembered a man fitting Frank's description from that era. The town of Harmony Creek itself was small. Someone must have seen something. Someone must have known something if Frank, or whoever was with him, had brought 3 captive boys to that motel, had dug that hole, had committed such an unspeakable act. The motel's old guest registers, if they even still existed, were a primary target. Finding them after so many years, after changes in ownership and eventual foreclosure, seemed a slim hope, but every avenue had to be explored. Sarah remembered Frank mentioning a desire to visit old haunts on that trip, a vague phrase she had dismissed at the time, but now it echoed with a sinister resonance. What old haunts? Did Harmony Creek hold some forgotten, dark significance for him? The focus shifted from the immediate horror of the footage to the grim, methodical work of constructing a timeline, a chain of events. If the boys were in the trunk, and the camcorder recorded the sound of the ice machine, it implied they were brought to the motel in that car. The same station wagon later found abandoned hundreds of miles away in Arizona. This presented a new, horrifying possibility, that Frank, or whoever was driving, had taken them to the Starlight, imprisoned them, and then driven the car far away to create a false trail. A deliberate act of misdirection to throw off any investigation. The cold calculation of such an act was terrifying to contemplate. The trapdoor itself became an object of intense scrutiny. Forensic analysis of the soil within and around it, the wood of the hatch, the crude carvings of the initials, was undertaken. Were there any other traces, fibers, fingerprints, DNA, that could link someone specific to that space, to that time? The small, airless chamber was not just a prison, it was a potential tomb, and the investigators treated it with the grim reverence of an archaeological dig into the very heart of evil. Sarah felt a new wave of despair wash over her. The idea that her sons might have been alive, conscious, in that suffocating darkness, so close to the mundane world above, the comings and goings of motel guests. The rhythmic hum of the ice machine, a constant, mocking reminder of a life just out of reach, was a torment beyond words. How long had they been there? Had anyone heard them? The initials MRDKSP gouged into the wood were no longer just a tragic discovery. They were a scream for help. A last desperate act of identity in the face of oblivion, carved in the darkness by a small, trembling hand, a hand that knew its time was running out. The Starlight Motel, once a forgotten relic, now stood as a monument to unimaginable cruelty, its faded paint and broken windows silently testifying to the horrors it had concealed for so long. Its very name, a bitter irony against the darkness it had held. The shadow of Uncle Frank, Sarah's restless, enigmatic younger brother, lengthened and darkened with each passing day of the renewed investigation, his smiling, slightly shifty face from old photographs becoming the visage of a potential monster in the collective imagination of the investigators and, most painfully, in the fracturing remnants of Sarah's trust. He had been the one constant in the boys' disappearance, the one who had taken them, the one whose abandoned car had been the last known link to their journey, and now, with the discovery at the Starlight Motel, his actions, his motives, his entire troubled history were subjected to an intense, unforgiving scrutiny. Investigators delved into Frank's past with a forensic zeal, unearthing a life lived on the fringes, a pattern of impulsive decisions, minor grifts, and a notable lack of deep connections or lasting responsibilities. He had drifted from state to state, job to job, short-order cook, gas station attendant, seasonal farm work, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots or, it seemed, to be truly known. There were whispers of gambling debts, of associations with unsavory characters in dimly lit bars, but nothing concrete, nothing that definitively painted him as capable of the calculated, sadistic cruelty suggested by the trapdoor and the camcorder footage. Yet, the circumstantial evidence was damning. He had motive, perhaps financial, though no ransom demand was ever made. He had opportunity, being solely entrusted with the boy's care, and his subsequent disappearance, his complete vanishing act after abandoning the car, spoke volumes of guilt, of a desire to escape the consequences of an unspeakable act. The question that plagued Sarah, that twisted like a knife in her heart, was why? Why would Frank, her own brother, do this to her children, to his own nephews? What could have possessed him to inflict such terror, such suffering? Was it a sudden psychotic break? Was he under duress? Or was there a cold, premeditated evil lurking beneath his charming, feckless exterior that she had been too blind, too trusting, to see? Then, a breakthrough, or what seemed like one, came from an unexpected source. An old, retired waitress who had worked at a diner a few miles from the Starlight Motel in Harmony Creek back in the late 80s, her memory jogged by a news report about the reopened case, contacted Detective Reynolds. She vaguely remembered a man fitting Frank's description, a man who had been a regular for a short period around that summer of 1989, often quiet, brooding, sometimes with another man. A rougher type she didn't like the look of. She couldn't recall names, not after all these years, but she remembered the car, a big old station wagon, wood-paneled, just like Frank's. And she remembered him seeming agitated, stressed, once making a hurried phone call from the payphone outside, his voice low and angry. This sliver of a memory, fragile and imprecise as it was, placed Frank, or someone very much like him, in the vicinity of the Starlight Motel around the time the boys vanished, potentially with an accomplice. The theory that Frank hadn't acted alone gained traction. Could he have been coerced, perhaps by gambling associates to whom he owed money? Were the boys taken as leverage, a pawn in a dangerous game that had gone horribly, catastrophically wrong? This possibility offered Sarah a strange, perverse sliver of hope, not for Frank's innocence, but for a scenario where he was not the sole architect of this nightmare, perhaps even a reluctant participant, a victim himself in some twisted way. It was a desperate straw to clutch at, a way to mitigate the unbearable thought of her own brother being capable of such pure, unadulterated evil. However, the deeper investigators dug, the more elusive Frank became. he had effectively ceased to exist after 1989. No Social Security activity, no driver's license renewals, no credible sightings. It was as if he too had been swallowed by the earth, leaving only the lingering poison of his actions. The focus then returned to the motel itself. Who owned the Starlight in 1989? Records showed it was a small family-run business, owned by an elderly couple, the Hendersons, no relation to the demolition foreman, who had sold it in the early 90s and had since passed away. Interviews with their surviving relatives yielded little. They remembered the motel as a struggling enterprise, a relic even then, its clientele transient, often paying in cash, few questions asked. It was the kind of place where someone could stay or do things unnoticed, especially if they knew the layout, knew the less frequented areas, like the space behind the main building where the ice machine stood, a spot shielded from the road, from prying eyes. Could Frank have had a connection to the Hendersons, or perhaps to a disgruntled employee, someone who knew about the unused crawlspace beneath the ice machine, a space that could be so easily converted into a hidden prison, the initials carved into the trapdoor, MRDKSP, became a focal point again. They were clearly the boys. This suggested they were alive, conscious, and alone in that pit for some period. But for how long? And what did that mean for Frank's involvement? If he had put them there, did he intend to come back, or was it a final desperate act before he fled? The camcorder footage was reanalyzed, searching for any sound, any whisper that might indicate another presence with Frank, or any hint of Frank's own emotional state if he was indeed the one heard shouting outside the trunk. But the audio was too poor, the evidence too circumstantial. Frank remained a ghost, a phantom architect of a horror whose full dimensions were still emerging from the grainy footage and the cold, damp earth of the Starlight Motel. The suspicion around him was immense, a suffocating blanket of probability, yet without his body, without a confession, without a direct, irrefutable link placing him inside that pit with the boys, a sliver of ambiguity remained, a tormenting question mark at the heart of the tragedy. Was he the sole perpetrator, a monster hidden in plain sight? Or was he a pawn, a coward, a victim himself, dragged into a vortex of evil by forces unknown? The answer, it seemed, might have died with him, or lay buried as deeply as the secrets of the Starlight Motel itself. The day came when the technicians announced they had salvaged and sequenced the entirety of the recoverable footage from the JVC camcorder, a chilling chronicle that promised to fill in the remaining, terrifying blanks in the boys' final journey. The atmosphere in the viewing room was heavier than ever, thick with a dread that was almost palpable, as Sarah, flanked by Detective Reynolds and a grief counselor, prepared to witness what she knew would be the hardest moments of her life, the final act of her son's tragedy, played out on a cold, impersonal screen. The newly restored segments picked up where the previous ones had left off. In the suffocating darkness of the trunk, the boys' lethargy now profound, their small bodies huddled together, barely moving, their breathing shallow and infrequent. The sounds from outside had changed. The continuous rumble of the highway had ceased, replaced by a more intermittent, closer noise, the crunch of tires on gravel, the slam of a car door, then voices. Clearer now, closer, imbued with a chilling urgency. And among them, Sarah heard it, a voice that ripped through her soul, a voice she had known all her life, a voice that had once sung her lullabies, that had teased her and made her laugh. Now twisted into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. Frank's voice, clear, undeniable. He wasn't shouting, not then, but speaking in low, harsh tones to someone else, words she couldn't quite make out, a hurried, conspiratorial exchange that sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. Her brother. It was him, Any lingering, desperate hope that he was a minor player, a coerced victim, shattered into a million pieces. He was there. He was involved. The camera, still lying on its side, captured a sliver of light as the trunk lid was suddenly, violently thrown open, flooding the small space with a blinding, disorienting glare. The boys flinched, whimpering, shielding their eyes. Then, rough hands, large male hands reached in, grabbing them one by one with brutal efficiency. Michael, ever the protector, tried to resist, a small, futile struggle, a choked cry of no, before he was hauled out. Danny was next, limp, unresisting, his eyes wide with a terror that had transcended screaming. Then Sam, so small, so fragile, lifted out as easily as a doll, his plush rabbit, Hopper, falling from his grasp to the dirty floor of the trunk, forgotten. The camcorder, jostled in the sudden movement, fell, its lens now pointing erratically towards the opening of the trunk, capturing a fleeting, horrifying tableau. For a few sickening seconds, the Starlight Motel's faded sign, its grotesque, winking star, was visible in the background, stark against a twilight sky, an irrefutable link. Then, the frame filled with Frank's face, his features contorted in a mask of something Sarah couldn't name: fear, desperation, cruelty. He glanced down, saw the camcorder, his eyes widening for a fraction of a second before he reached for it. The screen went black. A click. He had turned it off. But then, moments later, impossibly, it flickered back on. The screen was dark, almost entirely black, but the audio, oh God, the audio. Frank must have fumbled with the controls, accidentally restarting the recording before tossing it, perhaps intending to retrieve it later, perhaps simply discarding it in his haste. It must have landed inside the pit, amidst the chaos of what happened next. The sounds were muffled, terrifyingly close. The scraping of a shovel against earth, heavy grunts of exertion. Then the boys' voices, not whimpers now but cries, actual cries of terror, of pain, small, helpless sounds swallowed by the vast indifference of the coming night. Michael's voice, "Please, Uncle Frank, please don't." Danny, screaming, a raw, animal sound of pure fear. And Sam, just "Mommy, Mommy, Mommy," over and over, a litany of despair that would haunt Sarah for the rest of her days. Frank's voice again, harsh, brutal, "Quiet, be quiet, damn you." And then another voice, rougher, deeper, unfamiliar. "Hurry up, Frank, get it done. Someone might see. An accomplice." The waitress had been right. Frank wasn't alone. This new voice was cold, impatient, utterly devoid of any human compassion. The sounds continued, a sickening symphony of cruelty, the thud of something heavy, a choked gasp, more digging, the terrified, fading cries of her children. Sarah was sobbing openly now, her body racked with tremors, Reynolds holding her hand tightly, the grief counselor murmuring words of comfort that couldn't possibly penetrate the wall of her agony. She was listening to her children die. She was listening to her brother and another man murdering them. The tape recorded perhaps 10 more minutes of these horrifying sounds, the boys' cries growing weaker, more sporadic, until finally, chillingly, there was only the rhythmic thud of the shovel, the heavy breathing of the two men, and then silence. A profound, terrible silence, broken only by the distant chirping of crickets and the faint, almost subliminal hum of what could only be the ice machine. Then footsteps receding, the slam of a car door, an engine starting, and the sound of a vehicle driving away, leaving behind only the darkness, the silence, and the camcorder, still recording, a forgotten witness in a shallow, hastily covered grave. The tape ran on for another hour, recording nothing but the oppressive, earthen silence of the pit, the occasional drip of moisture, the faint hum, until the battery finally, mercifully died, the screen dissolving into a permanent, snowy blackness. When it ended, Sarah sat broken, a hollowed-out shell of a woman, the truth she had sought for 33 years revealed in its full, unadulterated horror. Her boys hadn't just vanished. They had been betrayed, terrified, and brutally murdered by their own uncle and an unknown accomplice, their small bodies left in a makeshift grave beneath a motel ice machine. The why remained elusive: a drug deal gone wrong, a ransom attempt that spiraled out of control, a simple, motiveless act of pure evil. The tape offered no answers to that, only the brutal, undeniable how and the devastating who. The initials carved into the hatch, MRDKSP, now took on an even more profound, heartbreaking significance. They hadn't just been a cry for help. They had been a final act of defiance, a testament carved in the face of certain death, ensuring they would not be forgotten, ensuring that someday, somehow, their story would be known. And now, thanks to a forgotten camcorder and the relentless march of time that had brought a derelict motel to its knees, it was. The revelation from the camcorder tape sent shockwaves through the small community of Harmony Creek and far beyond, transforming a tragic cold case into an active, horrifying homicide investigation. The grainy images, the chilling audio of Michael, Danny, and Sam's final terrifying moments, and the undeniable presence of Frank Parsons' voice galvanized law enforcement with a renewed, grim determination. The search for Frank, now elevated from a missing person of interest to the prime suspect in a triple murder, along with his unidentified accomplice, became a nationwide manhunt. His 33-year-old photograph plastered across news channels and internet forums, a ghost dredged up from a dark past. The Starlight Motel site, already a place of grim fascination, was meticulously excavated. Beneath the layer of dirt where the camcorder and shoes had been found, in the compacted earth of the pit, forensic anthropologists, working with the delicacy of archaeologists, uncovered the fragile, skeletal remains of 3 small children. Dental records, though sparse for such young ages, along with DNA analysis comparing the remains to Sarah's, provided the irrefutable, heartbreaking confirmation: Michael, Daniel, and Samuel Parsons had been found. Their long journey was over. They were home, but not in the way Sarah had prayed for every single night for over 3 decades. The town of Harmony Creek, which had lived with the shadow of the boys' disappearance for so long, reacted with a mixture of horror, grief, and a strange, communal sense of shame that such an atrocity could have occurred in their midst, concealed for so many years beneath such a mundane fixture as an ice machine. Vigils were held, flowers and teddy bears piled up against the yellow police tape surrounding the Starlight, a spontaneous memorial to the lost innocence the boys represented. The media descended, turning Harmony Creek into the reluctant epicenter of a national tragedy, its residents hounded for soundbites, its quiet streets filled with satellite trucks. For Sarah, the confirmation of their deaths, while anticipated after viewing the tape, brought a new, profound wave of grief, a finality that was both a release from the torture of uncertainty and an immersion into the cold, hard reality of irreversible loss. There would be no miraculous reunion, no possibility of healing their trauma, only the grim task of burying her sons, of laying their small bodies to rest after so long. The legal process began to grind forward, even in Frank's absence. An arrest warrant was issued for Frank Parsons and John Doe, his accomplice, for 3 counts of first-degree murder. Investigators painstakingly re-interviewed anyone who had ever known Frank, searching for clues to his whereabouts, to the identity of the second man whose cold voice had echoed on that tape. The waitress from the diner, her memory now crucial, worked with a sketch artist, producing a likeness of the rougher type she had seen with Frank, a face that was circulated alongside Frank's. Another ghost to be hunted. Yet, Frank Parsons remained elusive, a phantom. Had he died in the intervening years? Was he living under an assumed identity? A chameleon who had shed his old skin and disappeared into the anonymous sprawl of the country? Or had he, perhaps, met his own violent end at the hands of his accomplice, a loose end silenced? These questions tormented Sarah, tormented the investigators. Without Frank, without the accomplice, true justice, the kind that involved accountability in a courtroom, felt agonizingly out of reach. The why also continued to haunt everyone involved. What was the motive behind such a monstrous act? The tape offered no clues. Was it a kidnapping for ransom that went horrifically wrong? But no ransom note was ever received. Was it related to Frank's potential gambling debts? The boys used as leverage against him, or by him against others, with catastrophic consequences? Or was it something even darker, more personal, a sudden explosion of rage, or a deep-seated psychopathy that had finally erupted? The accomplice's identity was another gaping hole in the narrative. Who was he? A local? Another drifter Frank had picked up? His cold, emotionless voice on the tape suggested a hardened criminal, someone perhaps more adept, more ruthless than Frank himself. The investigation branched out, looking into unsolved crimes from that era in Arizona and neighboring states, searching for a similar modus operandi, for any link to the unidentified voice. But after 3 decades, trails grew cold, memories faded, and the chances of identifying him, let alone apprehending him, diminished with each passing day. The Starlight Motel itself was eventually razed to the ground, its foundations dug up, every square inch searched, but it yielded no further secrets, its role as an unwitting tomb now over. The earth where the ice machine once stood, where the trapdoor had hidden its horrors, was consecrated, a small, private ceremony held by Sarah and a few close supporters. A quiet attempt to reclaim the ground from the evil it had harbored. Yet even with the boys found, with Frank identified as their killer, a sense of incompleteness lingered, a raw, open wound. The accomplice was still out there. Frank was still out there, or his fate unknown, and the ultimate reason for her son's murders remained shrouded in a darkness as profound as the pit in which they had died. The world knew what had happened to Michael, Danny, and Sam, but the full measure of justice, the complete understanding of the evil that had consumed them, felt like it might remain forever elusive. Another ghost to haunt the long, empty years ahead for Sarah. The funeral for Michael, Daniel, and Samuel Parsons was held on a crisp autumn morning, the kind of bright, clear day that felt like a mockery in the face of such profound, unseasonable sorrow. 3 small caskets, draped in white, stood side by side, a testament to lives cut brutally short, to a future stolen not just from them, but from all who had loved them, especially from Sarah. Their mother, who stood before them, a figure of immense, heartbreaking dignity, her silver hair catching the sunlight that filtered through the stained glass windows of the small chapel. She had chosen this place, far from Harmony Creek, far from the shadows of the Starlight Motel, a place of quiet contemplation, a place where her boys could finally rest in peace, a peace they had been denied for so long. She didn't speak at the service. Her grief was too immense, too raw for public display, her words trapped in her throat, a silent scream that had been building for 33 years. But in her hand, she clutched 3 small, smooth stones, one for each of her sons, stones she had picked from the banks of the creek where they used to play, a tangible connection to the innocent, joyful days before their world, and hers, had fractured into a million irreparable pieces. After the service, after the hushed condolences and the sympathetic eyes, after the final, agonizing act of watching their caskets lowered into the earth, Sarah found herself alone. Or as alone as one could be with the weight of such a loss. Detective Reynolds had offered to stay, but Sarah had gently declined. This was a path she had to walk by herself now, the final steps of a journey that had consumed her life. She didn't return to the house immediately, the house that was both a shrine and a prison of memories. Instead, she drove, aimlessly at first, then, with a growing sense of purpose, towards the coast, towards the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean, a place her boys had always dreamed of seeing but never had. She walked along the shore, the cold wind whipping at her hair, the rhythmic crash of the waves a mournful soundtrack to her thoughts. The truth, she now knew, was a double-edged sword. It had sliced away the agonizing tendrils of uncertainty, the not knowing that had been a daily torture, but it had also laid bare the full unmitigated horror of their end, an image, a soundscape, that would forever be seared into her consciousness. There was a form of closure, yes, a brutal, tragic closure, but peace? Peace felt like a distant, unattainable shore. How could there be peace when Frank, her own brother, the man whose hands had snuffed out those bright, precious lives, was still out there, a fugitive from justice, his motives perhaps forever shrouded in mystery? How could there be peace when the voice of his accomplice, cold and cruel, still echoed in the recesses of her memory, a nameless, faceless embodiment of evil? She knew the detectives would continue to search, that the case would remain open, but she also knew the reality of time, of dwindling resources, of the world's tendency to move on. Justice, in its fullest sense, might never come. But as she stood there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep sorrowful purple, a different kind of understanding began to settle within her. Her boys were no longer lost, they were found. Their story was known. Their final, desperate act of carving their initials, of unknowingly recording their ordeal, had not been in vain. They had spoken from beyond the silence, and the world had finally listened. She opened her hand and looked at the 3 small stones, worn smooth by time and water. Michael, Danny, Sam. She said their names aloud, her voice carried away by the wind, a whisper to the universe. She would never forget them, never stop loving them, never stop missing the vibrant, joyful energy they had brought into her world. The pain would always be there, a part of her, like the scar tissue around a grievous wound, a constant reminder of what she had lost. But perhaps, she thought, perhaps she could learn to carry it differently. Perhaps the knowing, as terrible as it was, would allow her to slowly, painstakingly, begin to rebuild some semblance of a life around the vast, empty space they had left behind. It would not be the life she had imagined, the life she had been robbed of, but it would be a life lived in their memory, a life that honored their brief, bright existence. She thought of the camcorder, that unlikely oracle, a piece of cheap plastic and magnetic tape that had held the key to so much pain, but also to so much truth. It was a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, sometimes a flicker of light can emerge, a voice can be heard, a story can be told. As the last sliver of sun disappeared, she took the 3 stones and, one by one, threw them as far as she could into the churning waves, watching them disappear into the vast, dark water. It wasn't an act of forgetting, but an act of release, of entrusting their spirits to something larger, something eternal. She turned and walked back towards the shore, the sand cold beneath her feet, the taste of salt on her lips. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with an emptiness she couldn't yet comprehend, but for the first time in 33 years, there was a path, however shadowed, however painful. She would walk it, for them, for herself. The resilience of the human spirit, she realized, was a strange and stubborn thing, capable of enduring unimaginable loss, capable of finding a way to continue, even when all hope seemed extinguished. Her boys were gone, but their love, their memory, would remain, an indelible part of who she was, a light that even the deepest darkness could never truly overcome.